The morning sun cut through the courthouse windows in narrow beams, illuminating rows of polished benches and casting long shadows across courtroom 6B. It was standing room only. Spectators lined the walls, reporters clutched notepads, and a few veterans in the gallery wore quiet expressions of concern and pride. At the centre of it all stood Staff Sergeant Raymond Holt, a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a clean but well-worn military blazer. On his head, a faded olive-drab campaign hat adorned with a subtle insignia, one that only fellow veterans would recognize. The brim shadowed his brow, but not his dignity. Judge Elaine Watterson, a woman known for her strict adherence to decorum, peered over her glasses from the bench. "Mr. Holt," she said, tapping her gavel lightly, "this is a court of law, not a barracks. I must ask you to remove your headwear. Now." A hush fell over the room. Raymond didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, as if measuring the weight of the moment. Then he slowly stood, turned toward the judge, and spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I wear this hat for the men I buried under foreign skies, for the brothers I couldn't carry back. If I take it off—" "Mr. Holt," the judge interrupted sternly, "no speeches, just respect this courtroom. Remove the hat." The bailiff stepped forward, sensing escalation. Raymond's daughter, seated beside him, whispered, "Dad, it's okay." But it wasn't okay, and Raymond knew it. He reached up with a slow hand and began to lift the hat off his head. The court held its breath, and then a collective gasp. Beneath the hat was a deep, jagged scar that ran from the crown of Raymond's head down to his temple. The kind of scar that told a story no book could capture. The kind of scar that wasn't just physical, but historical. Murmurs swept through the gallery. The judge blinked, thrown off her rhythm. "Mr. Holt, what happened to you?" Raymond's voice was calm, measured. That's where a piece of Kandahar almost took me home." The room went still. Even the stenographer forgot to type for a second. Then Raymond placed the hat gently on the defense table. He didn't sit. He didn't flinch. He looked straight ahead, his hands behind his back, just like the day he graduated boot camp. Judge Watterson looked down, momentarily silent, and then, her voice softer, asked, "Would you tell the court what led to this hearing today?" Raymond nodded once. "If you're sure you're ready to hear it." The courtroom leaned in, every soul in that room sensing that what came next wouldn't just be a defense, it would be a reckoning. Raymond Holt's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried weight simply by existing. "You asked what brought me here, Your Honor," he began, eyes focused not on the judge but somewhere past her, like he was seeing a different room, one filled with tents and sandbags instead of polished oak and gavels. "I didn't come here to fight," he said. "I came here because I was trying to stand up for a boy who couldn't stand for himself. His name was Caleb." At the name, his daughter reached into her purse, pulling out a worn envelope. Inside, a folded photograph. She clutched it, knuckles white. Raymond continued. "Caleb was 15. He lived 3 houses down from me. His father was deployed. His mom worked double shifts. I used to mow her lawn when I was still recovering, still learning to walk without a cane. That boy, he reminded me of my son." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "One day, Caleb showed up at my door crying. Said they were kicking him out of school for wearing his dad's dog tags. Said a teacher told him it was inappropriate symbolism. Said patriotism had become too political." A reporter in the front row shifted uncomfortably. "I walked into that school the next day, hat on, blazer pressed. I didn't yell, didn't curse, just asked to speak to the principal." The judge leaned forward slightly, her fingers steepled. Raymond's tone stayed even. "I asked why a child honoring his deployed father was being punished. The principal said rules were rules. And when I asked if the rules had room for sacrifice, he said, 'We're trying to move past all that.'" Gasps rippled across the courtroom. "I told him," Raymond said, his eyes narrowing, "that you don't move past the people who die for you. You remember them. You teach your children to remember." He looked straight at the judge now. "Then I walked out, but not before every kid in that hallway stood and saluted. They didn't know how else to say they disagreed." Judge Watterson sat back slowly. "And then, the lawsuit," Raymond nodded. "The school filed a complaint, said I was inciting unrest. They got a court order to restrict me from speaking at public school board meetings. That's why I'm here. Because apparently, standing silently in a hallway wearing a military hat is now a threat. The courtroom shifted uneasily. A woman in the gallery dabbed her eyes. Judge Watterson tapped her pen against the bench, slower now. "Mr. Holt, why didn't you fight this sooner?" Raymond's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Because I was tired of fighting. But my scar didn't heal, so I could sit down when a boy gets shamed for loving his father." At that moment, the judge didn't respond. No one did. Because there were no words. Only the weight of what had just been said. And the realization that this wasn't just a hearing. It was history trying to speak. As Raymond Holt stood silent for a moment, the courtroom itself seemed to pause with him, caught between the echo of his last words and the heaviness of what they meant. Then slowly, from the defense table, his daughter unfolded the photograph. She stood. "Your Honor," she said, voice trembling but clear, "with your permission, I'd like to submit this." Judge Watterson gestured with a slow nod, her demeanor softened now, less judge, more human. The clerk took the photo and passed it up. The judge studied it. A teenage boy stood proudly in the picture. Freckles, soft eyes, an oversized flannel shirt, and around his neck his father's dog tags, dangling against his chest like armor. He stood next to Raymond. Same campaign hat, same steely pride. Same message. Some values don't age out, Judge Watterson exhaled. "Who took this photo?" she asked. "I did," Raymond's daughter replied, "the day after the school sent Caleb home." Raymond spoke again. "He wore those tags to feel close to his father, the same way I wore my hat, not to cause trouble, but to hold on to something real." He looked over at the prosecutor's table. "Trouble," he said softly, "doesn't come from tradition. It comes from forgetting it." The judge narrowed her eyes. "But the school claimed you violated trespassing laws." Raymond nodded. "I never went past the lobby. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't touch a soul. I just stood there for 5 minutes. A quiet, still figure with a hat and a question. Since when did honor become a disruption?" Gasps again. This time from 2 rows of veterans who had entered quietly during the last exchange. All wore subtle signs of service. Lapel pins, ribbons, a certain bearing in their shoulders. They weren't disruptive. They were present. The judge took note. "Mr. Holt," she asked, more gently now, "what is it you want this court to do?" He looked at her squarely. "I don't want money. I don't want revenge. I want this courtroom to say something the school wouldn't, that honoring a soldier, especially one who's still out there, isn't a violation." He paused. "It's a vow." A long silence followed, until a soft voice spoke from the gallery. A child's voice. "I still wear mine too," said a boy in the 3rd row, standing up, holding out his own set of dog tags. No one knew him. No one had prompted him. But he became part of the moment. The judge's eyes flicked back and forth, at the boy, at the photo, at the scar on Raymond's head, and the quiet sea of veterans filling the gallery now like guardians of a forgotten truth. What had started as a disciplinary hearing was fast becoming something else, something national. Judge Watterson tapped her pen again, 3 times, slower now. Not to assert control, but to stall. She needed a moment. Everyone did. The courtroom had shifted. What began as a routine municipal hearing now pulsed with something deeper. You could feel it in the air. The hush wasn't silence, it was reverence. "I'll allow further comment," she finally said, clearing her throat, "but I remind everyone, this is a court, not a campaign." Raymond gave a small nod. "With respect, Your Honor, I'm not running for anything. I already served." The quiet clapped louder than any words. At the back of the gallery, a woman stood up. Hair pinned neatly, blazer starched. She held up an envelope. "Permission to speak?" she asked. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You are?" "Major Rachel Estaves. Retired. I served 2 tours in Iraq, and I'm also the mother of Caleb, the boy this case is about." The room froze. Even Raymond turned, stunned. His daughter's eyes widened. Major Estaves stepped forward, heels clicking across the tile, every inch the soldier. She approached the front. "I was in Kuwait when the school sent my son home," she said. "They didn't even wait for me to come back, just stripped him of his right to honor me, without asking if I minded." The judge leaned forward. "Do you?" "I mind that they didn't let him," she said. "Not that he did." She turned to Raymond. "I never got to thank you," she said softly, "for standing in that hallway when I couldn't." Raymond's lips parted, but nothing came out. He just nodded. The kind of nod that carries weight medals don't measure. Major Estaves placed the envelope on the bench. These are letters from military parents across the country. Teachers too, over 200 of them, all saying the same thing. What that school called a disruption, we call dignity. The judge looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it yet. Instead, she looked at Raymond, then at Major Estaves, then at the boy still holding his dog tags in the gallery. Something changed in her face, softer now, not pity, understanding. "I'll recess for 20 minutes, she said, standing, "but I want both sides prepared when I return, because this isn't just about a hallway anymore." Her gavel struck once, sharp, echoing, not as judgment, but as awakening. People didn't rush out, they whispered, cried quietly. Veterans clasped each other's hands without words. And Raymond? He sat back down, but left his hat on the table, because now everyone had already seen what was beneath it, and no one would forget it. The gavel had barely struck before people began texting, calling, posting photos of Raymond's scar, the boy in the gallery with dog tags, the envelope of letters placed on the bench like a declaration of values. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. "Honor is not disruption. Let them wear it. The man with the hat." Outside the courthouse, news vans began arriving. Inside, the atmosphere simmered, not with outrage, but with an ache that had been ignored too long. The ache of a country asking itself a simple question: when did we become ashamed of our heroes? Raymond sat quietly during the recess, staring at the floor. His daughter leaned in. "You okay?" He nodded once. "Just thinking about all the ones who never got a courtroom, just a folded flag and a hallway no one stood in." She squeezed his hand. Across the room, Major Estaves was on her phone with her son, Caleb. "Yes, sweetheart, I saw the photo Mr. Holt showed them. No, I'm not mad. I'm proud. You reminded people." She paused, blinking back tears. "Yes, baby. I'll tell them your dad says hi." Back at the prosecution table, the district lawyer, young, polished, clearly shaken, flipped through her notes with less certainty now. She whispered to her assistant, "We need to rethink our angle. This isn't about trespassing anymore. This is turning into something way bigger than school policy." Her assistant nodded. "It's already gone viral." Judge Watterson hadn't returned yet, but in her chambers she wasn't sipping coffee. She was standing at the window, staring at the growing crowd gathering outside. Some held small American flags. Others had signs. "Silencing honor is not justice. Scars speak louder than rules. Let them wear their stories." She turned away from the glass. Back at her desk sat the envelope of letters. She opened it. The first letter read, "My son never made it past Fallujah. His school won't let his little brother wear a patch in his memory. They say it might offend others. I ask only this: who will speak for the children left behind?" The judge folded the letter slowly, closed her eyes, and whispered, "What are we doing?" Back in the courtroom, Raymond stood and walked toward the gallery, toward the boy who had spoken up. He knelt beside him. "What's your name, son?" "Landon," the boy whispered. Raymond pulled something from his jacket, his old unit coin, a token earned, never bought. He placed it in Landon's hand. "Keep this, not because of me, but because you spoke when it mattered." Landon clutched it like treasure. By the time Judge Watterson returned, the courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was a living memorial, and the next moment would change everything. The judge's footsteps echoed as she re-entered the courtroom. The room rose, not out of formality, but out of collective tension. Something was happening here that no one could name yet, but everyone felt. She sat, then did something no one expected. She stood back up. Judge Watterson, known across the state for being cold, by the book, and notoriously unsentimental, placed her hands on the bench and said, "Before we continue with legal arguments, I have a question. For Mr. Holt." Raymond rose, spine straight, eyes steady. "You wore your hat in protest, Mr. Holt, but what was the deeper reason? Not the event, not the school. I mean you. Personally. Why that day?" The court held its breath. Even his daughter looked puzzled. Raymond looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred. Then up again. "There's something I never told anyone, not even her," he said, nodding to his daughter. He stepped forward, closer to the bench. "The night before I went to that school, I got a call from the VA. They told me one of my old squad mates didn't make it." A pause. "They weren't talking about a battlefield. They were talking about a garage, a hose, a closed door." The courtroom went silent. "I put on my hat the next morning," he said, voice heavy, "because I was tired of funerals, tired of silence, tired of pretending that the war ended when we flew home. It didn't. It followed us." He tapped the brim of the hat still lying on the table. "This hat, it's not decoration. It's memory. It's mourning. It's the only piece of uniform I have left that doesn't wrinkle in a closet. It's my way of saying they mattered, even when no one was looking." People in the back sniffled. A reporter wiped her eye and kept writing. The judge sat back down slowly, visibly moved, and then she said the words that would ricochet through media outlets within the hour. "Mr. Holt, this court owes you something, and I don't mean an apology. I mean a correction." She looked directly at the prosecutor. "Do you still wish to proceed with the motion to penalize this man?" The young lawyer hesitated. "Your Honor, the statute—" "I didn't ask about the statute," Watterson interrupted. "I asked about the human." The lawyer looked down. "No, Your Honor, the state withdraws its complaint." Gasps. Cheers tried to rise, but the judge raised a hand. "This isn't a pep rally. This is a moment of clarity." She turned back to Raymond. "Do you have anything else you wish to add?" He looked around the room, then nodded once. "I do." He picked up his hat and placed it gently over his heart. What he said next would ripple across the country by nightfall. Raymond stood tall, his campaign hat pressed against his chest like a sacred emblem. The courtroom was still. No shifting, no coughing, no scribbling from journalists. Even the cameras that had quietly entered during recess zoomed in and held their shot. "I only have a few words left," Raymond said, "but they're not mine." He looked slowly around the courtroom, locking eyes with teachers, students, veterans and strangers who had shown up for a hearing and found themselves in history. "When I stood in that hallway," he continued, "they said it made the students uncomfortable, that my presence was too political." He looked down at the boy, Landon, still clutching the unit coin. But no one asked if it was more uncomfortable to forget than to remember. He cleared his throat, then looked to the judge. "May I recite something, Your Honor?" Watterson nodded cautiously. "As long as it's brief." Raymond turned toward the courtroom. His voice didn't raise, but somehow every syllable struck like a bell. "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." The last three words echoed. The courtroom didn't erupt. It stood. One by one, without prompting, veterans rose. Teachers stood. Children followed. Even the judge didn't stop them. A quiet moment hung in the air as if the room itself had taken a collective breath and wasn't ready to let it go. Raymond slowly placed the hat back on his head, not to defy, not to provoke, but to honor. Judge Watterson leaned forward again. "Mr. Holt, you came here today accused of violating a policy, but what you've reminded us is that some unwritten codes matter more." She glanced at the prosecutor. "Since the state has withdrawn its complaint, I hereby dismiss the case with prejudice. No fines, no restrictions." Applause tried to burst, but again the judge raised her hand. Not applause, reflection. She turned back to Raymond. "You may go, Sergeant Holt, and take with you this court's respect." As Raymond walked back to his seat, someone began humming from the gallery, a quiet, almost trembling tune. "God Bless America." Others joined in. Not loudly, just enough to turn a courtroom into a sanctuary of memory. And outside the courthouse the crowd had doubled, phones held high, flags waving, not in protest, not in anger, in remembrance. As the humming quieted and the judge gavelled the courtroom back to order, Raymond Holt stood with tears threatening but held at bay, not for himself, but for the moment, for what it meant, for who it honored. The judge gathered her papers, but before she could exit, Major Estevez stood again. "Your Honor," she said respectfully, "I'd like to make a formal motion, not as an officer, as a mother." Judge Watterson paused. "Go on." Estevez stepped forward, hand placed gently over her heart. "I ask this court to issue a formal statement, publicly recorded, affirming the right of any student to honor a parent in service with non-disruptive symbols of remembrance." The gallery murmured. Watterson glanced at the prosecutor's table. The young attorney, still shaken but now visibly humbled, nodded slowly. The state would not oppose such a statement. Raymond sat down. He didn't need to speak anymore. Others were speaking now. That was the miracle. The scar wasn't his alone anymore. It had been shared. Judge Watterson addressed the room. This court will issue that statement. Effective immediately, the record will reflect this court's position. Symbolic acts of peaceful remembrance rooted in familial military service are not to be considered disruptions. They are to be protected. A standing ovation wasn't allowed in a courtroom. But what followed was close. Dozens of veterans and civilians alike standing silently, hands over hearts, heads bowed. A new kind of verdict. One that didn't come from a gavel, but from conscience. Outside, the courthouse plaza had filled with more supporters. Some held folded flags in glass cases. Others wore their own dog tags, pulled from drawers where they'd quietly rested for years. One man even stood with a prosthetic leg polished for the occasion. On his shirt, a patch that read, "My brother died a hero. Let me say his name." Reporters flooded the steps as Raymond emerged from the building. Microphones extended. Cameras flashed. But he didn't stop for the press. He stopped in front of Landon, the young boy with the dog tags, bent down and said, "Promise me something." Landon nodded quickly. "Anything. When someone tells you to forget, you remember louder." Then Raymond looked out at the sea of phones, lights and signs. His voice didn't need amplification. "We didn't wear the uniform to be agreed with. We wore it so people could speak freely, even if they didn't agree with us. That's the deal." He pointed to his hat. "But don't mistake silence for peace, and don't confuse policies with principles, because we didn't serve for convenience, we served for truth." The crowd applauded, not like a rally, but like a funeral, like a salute, like a vow. Within hours, the footage had made its way to every major news outlet. Clips of Raymond Holt removing his hat, the long scar glinting beneath the courtroom lights, his soft-spoken retelling of Caleb, the child in the gallery holding his dog tags, Major Estevez standing in uniform, the courtroom rising to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, not out of ritual, but revival. News anchors across the country broke from standard programming to air the footage raw, uninterrupted. Some wept on camera. Others, visibly shaken, simply said, "This is the America we sometimes forget." On social media, the hashtags that had trended earlier exploded. The man with the hat, honor in court, scars tell stories. Let them wear it. Veterans posted their own photos in silent tribute, wearing old uniforms, holding folded flags, showing medals tucked away in drawers. One post stood out. A middle school teacher in Colorado wrote, "Tomorrow, I won't stop my student from wearing his grandfather's tags. I'll ask the class what they mean instead." In a Louisiana diner, a group of elderly veterans raised coffee cups in a quiet toast. In a Chicago subway, a mural artist began sketching Raymond's silhouette with the words, "You don't remove memory just because it's inconvenient." And in front of the school that had once sent Caleb home, parents gathered, not to protest, but to listen. Someone had written in chalk across the pavement, "They stood for us. Now we stand for them." Back at Raymond's modest home, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Offers, interviews, speeches, networks asking for exclusive rights. He turned off the ringer. His daughter asked, "Are you going to take any of them?" Raymond smiled faintly. "No. I said what I came to say." "But the whole country's listening now," she said. "I know," he said softly. "That's why I don't need to say it again." He walked into the living room, placed his hat gently back on the shelf, next to a wooden box with 5 medals, 1 flag, and a black and white photo of 3 men in a desert, smiling. Then he sat down. Just a man. Just a scar. Just a promise kept. But elsewhere, in classrooms, courtrooms, and quiet homes, what he did that day was still rippling, and the final wave hadn't even hit yet. Weeks had passed. The media frenzy had cooled, but the impact hadn't faded. Not in the schools, where new policies were being quietly rewritten. Not in courthouses, where judges began reconsidering what counted as a disruption. And not in hearts, especially of those who had long felt forgotten. In Washington, a senator gave a floor speech quoting Raymond's exact words, "Don't mistake silence for peace, and don't confuse policies with principles." The transcript was entered into the congressional record. A resolution was drafted, bipartisan, rare these days, honoring Raymond Holt and requesting the Department of Education issue guidelines to protect students honoring family military service. It passed. But Raymond, he didn't chase it. He didn't even watch it. Because on the day Congress voted, he was back at that same school hallway. Not in protest this time, by invitation. A new principal, young, respectful and quiet, walked beside him. "We're naming the Veterans Resource Room after you," she said. Raymond paused. I didn't do it for a name on a door. She nodded. That's why it means more. Inside the room, students were gathered. Some wore hats, others held dog tags or flags. There was even a table with photos of family members who had served. At the center, Caleb. He stood in front of his classmates and said, I got sent home for remembering my dad, but now remembering is part of the lesson. Then he turned to Raymond and added, You didn't just fight overseas, you fought for us, here. Raymond smiled, eyes glassy. It's easier when you're not fighting alone. The room clapped. That night, Raymond walked home alone under a soft dusk sky. His daughter had gone ahead to pick up groceries. His neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in years, so was he. He stopped outside his house. On the porch rail sat a package. No name, just a note, for the man who reminded us to remember. Inside was a simple wooden frame. It held a printout of a courtroom still frame. Raymond standing, hat in hand, scar visible, flag pin glinting in the light. Beneath it, some wear the uniform, some carry the scars, but all of them are worth remembering. He hung it inside his hallway, not for him, for whoever walked through his door next. Because his fight wasn't loud or angry or bitter. It was honest, it was quiet, and it changed everything.